Any induction agent that you use can drop blood pressure, even ketamine. This was underscored by the 2 papers that just came out from the NEAR database. And while these papers have some issues and we may not be able to tease out what is better, ketamine or etomidate, you've got to remember that both of those drugs can drop a patient's blood pressure during an intubation attempt, especially if your patient is hemodynamically fragile. We're going to look at some of the mechanisms of action of ketamine to further understand how ketamine can potentially drop your blood pressure. So first of all, ketamine reacts on this NMDA receptor, and it gives us that dissociation effect. That's why we give the drug, right? It interacts with a lot of other receptors. We think that it interacts with like the opioid and the muscarinic receptors. And we know that these are part of the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest nervous system. So when I stimulate these receptors, my blood pressure would naturally drop. So why does ketamine not always drop your blood pressure? Well, if we slide down the cell membrane, we see that I also have these sympathetic receptors as well as these catechol reuptake channels. And when my body is under stress, I release catechols, epinephrine, norepinephrine. They stimulate these receptors, they give me that fight or flight response, which helps me get through that stressful situation. Now, ketamine actually comes in and it blocks this catechol reuptake channel. So now, when I experience a stressful event and those catechols are produced, that channel is blocked. So there's more of those catechols to go around. I have increased stimulation of those receptors, and that sympathetic response that I'm getting from the ketamine outweighs any parasympathetic response that I got from the ketamine. So now let's talk about what happens when your body's under a lot of stress. Let's say that our patient is septic or anemic, or has some kind of stressor that is making them very hemodynamically fragile. Their heart rate is higher than their systolic blood pressure. We're worried about this patient. Well, your body reacts by giving lots of sympathetic stimulation. It gives these catechols, it stimulates these sympathetic receptors, and gives you that fight or flight response. If I continue to have that stressful event, I continue to make those catechols. I continue to stimulate those receptors to continue to get my body through that stressful event. Now let's look at this scenario and let's add ketamine to it. First of all, ketamine is going to hit this muscarinic and these opioid receptors, which will provide that parasympathetic stimulation, which we know is the rest or digest. It's also going to block this catechol reuptake channel. However, if our patient's been stressed for a while, my catechol supplies may be running low. I may not have as much epi or norepi to deal with. So just because that channel is blocked doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to have more catechols to stimulate these receptors. Additionally, these receptors may be desensitized. They've been getting hit so constantly with those epi and those norepinephrine molecules that they're desensitized. They don't give as much of a response. And you still get some response, but the combination of fewer catechols in circulation and those desensitized receptors, your response may be diminished even if you give ketamine. So in this situation, giving ketamine, the parasympathetic effects may actually outweigh the sympathetic effects and drop your blood pressure. So what induction agent should we use in the hemodynamically fragile patient? There's not a perfect induction agent. Every induction agent can potentially drop your blood pressure. That's why it's so important to respect blood pressure during an intubation attempt. If your patient is hemodynamically fragile before you start, resuscitate before you intubate. Do the echo, see if they need fluids, get some pressors hanging, have everything ready so that if they drop their blood pressure, you'll be ready. Put an A-line in first. If you don't have time to do that, set your blood pressure cuff up to cycle every 3 minutes, so if they drop your blood pressure, you get an early warning rather than a late warning. Any induction agent, including ketamine, can drop the blood pressure during an intubation attempt. You need to be aware of this and you need to be prepared for this.